Good evening. Welcome to the Miller Theater. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. Even a week ago, we were expecting maybe half the numbers. And so tonight is great to see all of you here tonight for this program that was postponed from earlier this summer. But I think in terms of the topic, it is, I think it's still very relevant today. So we're really delighted that Professor Enze Han is with us, who he is Associate Professor at Department of Politics and Public Administration at Hong Kong U. And the book is available for sale in the back. Members get a discount, so please pick up a copy, and I'm sure Professor Han will be happy to sign it for you. And I'm glad, thank you for Professor Reyes for bringing this program to us, our scholar-in-residence. And you know, Al has done many programs for us before, so he really needs no introduction. But he is currently a senior fellow at the Center on Contemporary China and the World at University of Hong Kong, and has really has been done many, I think, moderated as well as speak on many programs for us, and we're really delighted that he proposed his program. As I said earlier, I think. Every day, I think there is something going on in the news about the region, Southeast Asia, and of course, the big elephant in the room is really China, isn't it? And so this is really a timely topic, and we're hoping to do more programs down the road on this, you know, the region and the particular topic. So I'm really delighted that all of you can be with us, and those of you who are not members, I would ask you to consider membership. We are going through, you know, we always need support because it's been a difficult year financially, but not programmatically. As you've seen on our programs this last year, where this is our last program of August, but September, there are some wonderful programs coming up. Of course, September 5th, we're going to have Professor Kishore Albani here in person for a lunch program. And my colleague, Holly, who I've been working for her very hard. Holly is working on so many programs coming up for September as well as October. And some of it will be related to the upcoming U.S. elections. And so please, if you like the program we do and like what we do, please support us by becoming a member. The more members we have, the more programs we can bring, interesting programs we can bring. You're not going to see me for a couple of weeks because I'm going tonight, leaving for the U.S., and I have meetings in the U.S., and I have to also go and pay my respect to my alma mater in Columbus, Ohio for a couple of days. And I wasn't looking forward to the trip, but now I am, because actually there's going to be a race going on, a really interesting couple of weeks coming up in the U.S., and we will be doing September 11th, an online program with Asia Society, Australia, India, and Japan and Hong Kong, an online program with experts from Asia looking at the U.S. elections. So these are just some of the stuff that's coming up. And so thank you all for being here tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Reyes and Professor Han to get the program started. Okay? Go ahead.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming to this hot evening in Hong Kong, and so I'm very happy to give this talk about this new book I published early this year, and it's on the ripple effect China's complex presence in Southeast Asia. Okay. So the starting point of this book essentially is a general phenomenon of the globalized China and how to understand it, right? So many scholars have commented on this sort of, Qin Guangli has talked about this multifaceted China's presence in its variety of forms, a variety of actors, and making its impact around the world. So the question motivating this research broadly is that how do we understand implications of such, let's say, globalized China, but also multifaceted China, and then particularly in terms of its implications and how do we understand China's influence defined broadly. Now, In the literature, some jargon, right, in terms of political science, international relations, studies on influence or on power and on sort of existing definitions, right? So conventionally speaking, for example, people tend to differentiate the concept of power from influence, right? So in the sense that influence, so despite, for example, some countries are big powers or great powers, superpowers, but then again, influence often means that the way to translate those power into a particular outcome, right? So this has been relatively conventionally utilized as a concept to describe influence. However, in terms of its actual understandings of the empirical manifestations of those influence operations, perhaps, there is often certain conflations, right? So first conflation is that is the tendency, for example, to conflate the state with non-state actors, right? And this is particularly the case when we get to China's situation, in a way that often everything is sort of lumped together as Chinese state, right? In reality, many non-state actors coming out from China are basically grouped together into this whole monolithic PRC in its implications. I think this needs to be empirically separated, and that's what I would discuss in detail later. The second point, and I want to emphasize, essentially, there is this conflation of intentionality with a particular outcome. Right? So often there is assumption that things happen must be because of particular intention by this state or this actor. Right? However, empirically, then usually this, we will find that the relationship between this, what happened on the ground, in fact, might be because of accidents or because some random effect or some chain effect that happened as a result of particular action. So in that sense, that I think empirically we need to differentiate this intentionality with the unintended, for example, consequences on the ground. So with that, essentially, that is, I will take you to this book, right? Essentially, we'll look at China and Southeast Asia, and then why these two concepts of influence, when we think about China's influence around the world, and why Southeast Asia in particular is important, right? And I think in many ways, Southeast Asia stands out from other parts of the world in terms of its intimate relations with China. So this is not only because of, let's say, this geographical proximity to China, right, and which means historically there were dynastical relations, and also let's say even in recent history, right, during Cold War, lots of intimate, let's say, communist movements, etc., were deeply tied with the PRC. But then again, what is also quite unique about Southeast Asia in comparison to other parts of the world is this migration encounter. That means during the past century or so, right, millions of ethnic Chinese have migrated out to Southeast Asia and then make this region intimate ethnically to China, also quite familiar from the both perspective. So that means this is a region that has, on the one hand, been a center of geopolitical competition, but also means the relationship between Southeast Asia and China are the most complex and also tend to be intimate. So with that, I will talk about the book of the argument of the book. Right, it's essentially extension, as what I mentioned early on about this, my intervention into these two concepts, two aspects of the influence concept. So the first one essentially is that the main thesis of the book, right, is in fact a antithesis, in a way that I'm arguing against some conventional wisdoms on China's influence in Southeast Asia. So in the sense that if we want to understand comprehensively China's presence in Southeast Asia and its implications, we need to not only, obviously, to look at the Chinese state and the Communist Party, etc., but also the variety of actors coming out from China, they are making that impact being felt within Southeast Asia. The second point, essentially, is to differentiate the intended versus unintended consequences of those variety of actors with their presence in Southeast Asia. So this essentially is kind of very straightforward, right? These two aspect argument that I will look at those non-state actors come from China, but also lots of things happen because they are simply the ripple effect of just because of so many actors in the region and they're making their implications felt. All right, so I will take you through three sort of snippets of the book. And I think this is basically 3 chapters of the book, but also I will later on expand a little bit more in terms of other things that it was covered in the book, or also with some kind of conversation with Al later on to some topics perhaps you will be interested in. So I'll start with economic dimension. I think people have already been familiar that China and Southeast Asian countries have developed a very intimate economic relations, right? Since 2009, China became the largest trading partner for ASEAN. And then in 2020, ASEAN became China's largest trading partner, right? So on paper, you look at these sort of statistics, right? It indicates that bilateral trade between China and Southeast Asia has improved significantly. But then again, what is driving this increased trade volume between China and Southeast Asia during the past few years, right? In fact, was because a non-related sort of event happened in the U.S., right? Because a trade war between China and the U.S. that leads to significant amount of trade between China and the Western countries being redirected via Southeast Asia, right? So this has been the effect some people have talked about as transshipment of much of the Chinese-made products through countries such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and also Cambodia, right? So that was basically the uptick of bilateral trade volume between China and Southeast Asia was because of the trade dispute between China and the U.S. Since 2020, when Trump administration imposed this sort of tariff on made in China products. So that's basically trade, right? In a way that on the one hand, there is this kind of fundamentals of bilateral trade integration, but also on the other hand, the increase of trade relations, in fact, was because of sort of accident, right? Happened not, due to geopolitical tensions between U.S. and China. Now we look at investment. So investment, in some ways, we can differentiate it from 2 broad categories. The first category is from state, right? So this is essentially, I would say, what people are familiar with, the Belt and Road Initiative, right, in terms of how China is pushing for further, closer, let's say, connectivity between China and its neighboring countries. So when Southeast Asia is concerned, it was the sort of maritime Silk Road, and then China was investing heavily in building, let's say, infrastructure in the region through railway, ports, and many other things to connect the region closer with China. So in this particular case, we do see the state has been very clearly represented in a sense of, for example, in this high-speed rail projects linking China to Laos and also further down to Thailand and Malaysia. Right. So in this particular case, right, the sections in Laos has already been completed in operation, and in fact, transboundary passenger trains has been in operation since April last year. Right. So which means these days the train has daily operations of at least one cross-border train between Kunming and Vientiane. And then further down to Thailand, right? The Thai section as well as the Malaysian section are ongoing, right? So there are different expectations, perhaps about 2027 or 2028. Then those sections, at least one connecting Nong Khai with Bangkok, perhaps will be completed, and also the Malaysian section connecting KL with Guatang will also probably be complete by then. So what does it mean, right? This means that the Chinese state, in this particular case, has laid down a very clear blueprint of how it envisioned is building an integrated infrastructure project that is unprecedented for Southeast Asia, because previously there's no such transborder, let's say, railway present in Southeast Asia. Right? So this is going to be, in some ways, milestone project, because China is able to set the standard of how this high-speed rail is going to operate. Right? So in the Laos section, for example, I took the train last December, and you can see that this train operates in a very much similar standard of what you expect in mainland China in terms of its language of broadcasting. Right? It's trilingual. It's Chinese, English, and then Lao, right? And also all the let's say stewardess on board on the train, they were all trilingual in terms of their operations and then the standard. Right? So I think in this particular case, we can see clearly the Chinese state has been has its intention, right, in terms of having this project in place and then perhaps realize this dream of further integration. But then again, when we get to the case of private capital coming out from China to Southeast Asia in recent years, so this is also, I would say, a response to some of the geopolitical tensions that's going on between China and the West in general. So one of the elements that has been driving this outbound Chinese capital to Southeast Asia, and in particular Singapore, is this, how should I say, this purpose, right, to separate the operations domestically in China versus the one that is going to be international, right? So this has been described as a phenomenon called Singapore washing. Means that Chinese private companies, right, big companies, they are taking up a alternative identity for themselves. Right? They try to play down that China connection to be considered as a Singaporean multinational corporation to be headquartered in Singapore for their international operation. Right? So this is basically, for example, best example of that would be TikTok. Right? Mother company would be ByteDance, TikTok versus Douyin within China. Even WeChat, right? Weixin versus WeChat. WeChat actually is headquartered in Singapore as well. So that has been the strategy for many mainland-based private companies in the effort to divest in a way, right? In terms of separate their operations domestically in China and also try to utilize Singapore's geopolitical sort of autonomy, right? To expand further around the world. So in this particular case, we see, in addition to this Singapore washing, but also means many Chinese-based companies have gone to Singapore and then became Singapore-based multinational corporations and expand further within Southeast Asia. So in this particular case, we see many big names in China for e-commerce, also for logistics, etc. They are all sort of either acquired locally based companies, right? So Alibaba, for example, acquired Lazada, which is one of the two largest sort of e-commerce platforms in Southeast Asia, right? So in Singapore, in Thailand, Indonesia, etc., right? Lazada is one of the main e-commerce platforms. Similarly, Shopee, right, which is also a Singapore-based, but then has significant amount of mainland capital in it. So these essentially, they are technically Singaporean companies, right? They are expanding their infrastructure presence within Southeast Asia, building up warehouses, logistic networks, and expanding its e-commerce footprint within Southeast Asia. Try to take advantage of this sort of, almost 600 million people, right, living in the region. But then again, substantial amount of this kind of capital behind it is, in some ways, the mainland Chinese footprint, right? And that, I think, is the very distinct feature, I think, for the past few years that mainland capital has sort of camouflaged, in a way, to be Singapore, right? Singapore watching. That's why this is, in some ways, why Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore, has become so important for China's outbound globalization strategy. And in fact, Hong Kong has been superseded by Singapore in this particular case. So let's move on to political dimensions. So one of the stories that has been quite centrally featured when we think about China's global influence usually is on this sort of question of regimes and what does it mean to have a largest sort of communist authoritarian government, right? And it seems it's doing well. So what does it mean for global sort of democratization or authoritarian resilience, right? So I think lots of people have raised this question in terms of how much sort of implication, how much China has done to empower perhaps authoritarian resilience around the world. So when we go to the question of Southeast Asia, the reality is lots of countries in Southeast Asia are in fact authoritarian. So with the exception of perhaps Philippines or Indonesia, all the other ones are somehow on a spectrum from being more authoritarian to slightly less authoritarian, right? And pretty much all the countries in mainland Southeast Asia these days are all authoritarian, right? So one might wonder, is that a particular factor just because you're closer to China geographically? Does that mean you're more likely to become authoritarian? Is there such a correlation we can draw, right? Pretty much you can think about from Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, pretty much everyone is authoritarian of different extents. So the question is, empirically, is that how can we draw the link between China's presence and authoritarian resilience in Southeast Asia? So we can think of three modes through which such Chinese influence is being played out. The first one, I think, is relatively straightforward. Right? It's the case of Myanmar, where at least on paper, Beijing's recognition of the military government in Myanmar in some ways empowered the military to some extent, and then offered this sort of international recognition that the military junta so desperately need. Right? So this is in some way does not need too much explanation. The second one, I think, it requires much more sort of teasing out what is exactly the causal mechanism between China and, let's say, authoritarian resilience in Cambodia. So in Cambodia's case, essentially, is that Cambodia is not isolated internationally, right? Does not need China to protect it. There's no need for diplomatic protection force and the UN. But Cambodia is very heavily dependent on Chinese money, meaning that Cambodia's trade, investment, for example, a quarter of FDI to Cambodia is from China. Also, more than half of ODA, official development aid, in Cambodia also come from China, which finance for 70% of Cambodia's infrastructure construction in the country. So in this particular case, and I argue, is that by relying upon cheap money from China, Cambodia can actually provide public goods for the country that otherwise a poor country like Cambodia could not do, right? So that means Cambodia is delivering for its people because they have the money from China to finance many of those infrastructure projects and also many public goods provisions in the country. So a good example of that actually was during COVID time, right? Cambodia was the country in Southeast Asia that managed to vaccinate its population in a very quick period of time. Only other than Singapore, which managed to vaccinate its population with money, right, buying lots of Moderna and then Pfizer from the West, but Cambodia somehow managed to vaccinate 90% of the population based on Chinese donation. So that was basically, I argue, indirectly, by having this sort of intimate economic relation from China, then it managed to deliver many of the public goods for its population, and then somehow indirectly leads to the performance legitimacy of Hong Sen's government. And finally, I will talk a little bit about Thailand. Thailand is even more complicated, right? Because Thailand is definitely not internationally isolated, and Thailand also does not need Chinese money as much because, in fact, the biggest FDI for Thailand is from Japan, and Thailand is also much bigger, right? Internationally more prominent in its diplomatic relations, etc. But then again, Thailand also has a long tradition of military governments in the country. So is there a particular link between China and its authoritarian resilience in Thailand, right? So when I examined the Thai case, what I found was in fact the causal error was the other way around. What does that mean? Means that it was authoritarian conservative forces in Thailand make use of China to empower themselves, to play down the domestic opposition forces in the challenge for the conservative military dominance. So that means in Thailand's context, the conservative royalist forces, in fact, are the ones most likely to play up the positive traits of China in terms of the law and order, in terms of its efficiency, and then try to project those images in its domestic propaganda, in contrast with the ones that, for example, the opposition forces try to, usually portray the opposition forces as either on the paper, on the paycheck of the U.S. and CIA, and that's basically how China, in some ways, is being incorporated into domestic politics within Thailand to empower the conservative at expense of the pro-democracy people. Right. So in this particular case, I would say the agency is in fact more on the Thai politicians or conservative forces themselves, rather than in terms of China deliberately or proactively try to influence Thai politics in general. Right. So I think this is, in some ways, three very different causal mechanisms through which China's presence, being authoritarian, has led to sort of the different forms of resilience within Southeast Asia. And then I did not talk about Vietnam, but Vietnam is in some ways the non-case, right? Basically, is that on paper, right, Vietnam is the communist party and then authoritarian, but in fact, Vietnam's resilience has nothing to do with China, right? In fact, Vietnam's resilience, Communist Party of Vietnam's resilience, in fact, is based on its anti-China credential rather than the other way around, right? So this is Vietnam. I did not discuss too much, but essentially it's the non-case that statistically you find this close correlation, but in reality has nothing to do with PRC at all. Now let's move on to a very mundane case of Chinese consumption and its implications for Southeast Asia. So I will talk briefly in terms of how the Chinese consumption of corn for the past decade or so has led to an accelerated process of deforestation in northern Myanmar. So this, in some ways, has to do with since 2000, let's say, 11, 12, Myanmar had this political economic opening, and then there's domestically economic boom, right? And it also leads to agricultural sort of transformation of its borderland regions with injections of capital investment into the country. So what happened since then was that there is, on the one hand, there's a global hike of corn prices. Basically, from 2011-12, there's a global spike of commodity prices. And then likewise, there is consequently, there's a huge expansion of maize cultivation in Myanmar. Now the reason is because China is these days is one of the biggest importer of those commodities, right? If you think about soybeans, corn, etc. So that means that because of this sort of long border between China and Myanmar, and then the price incentive is going the way of giving the farmers this sort of need, the incentive to plant maize, and that is basically has led to a significant expansion of maize cultivation in northern Myanmar that led to the accelerated deforestation in northern Myanmar. So this is obviously only one example, but then I can tell you, for example, for many other agricultural products, from fruits to vegetables, China these days is the biggest consumer for much of Southeast Asia's export in this particular sort of sector, right? So in Myanmar's case, for example, before COVID, right, more than 90% of Myanmar's watermelon will be exported to China. Today as well, Thailand, more than half of Thailand durian will go to China. So this kind of, in some ways, China's monopoly almost of certain agricultural sectors is in fact leading to lots of environmental problems within Southeast Asia because there's a huge demand and its market presence. So I'll wrap up. Basically, this is some of the ripple effect I try to convey in this book, in a sense that, first of all, there is multifaceted actors, variety of actors coming up from China, making their presence felt within Southeast Asia. And empirically, the state obviously is prominently featured, but then again, many other things are in fact carried out by non-state actors, are not related at all with the Chinese state. And finally, lots of things happen on the ground are in fact perhaps due to unintended consequences of those actors when they simply just being there on the ground in Southeast Asia. So this is a rundown of the outline of the book, and then I'll be very happy to talk of any of these topics if you're interested in the Q&A, and also I'm very glad to have a conversation with Al on some of his questions about China, Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and let me add my welcome to all of you, and my thanks to Alice Mong and Holly Smith and the Asia Society Hong Kong Center for holding this event. I'd also like to just give a special welcome to the Asia Global Fellows who have just arrived in Hong Kong, Asia Global Fellows of the University of Hong Kong. So welcome to you all. Thank you very much, Enze. That was very interesting. I recommend the book to everybody. If I might, your description of China-Southeast Asia relations as intimate really resonates with me, because by DNA, I'm 17% Chinese. I'm 17% from the Xiamen area by DNA, very precise. So, I mean, that's the story of Southeast Asia, right? In terms of the mixing of the populations, the presence of Chinese culture, I mean, many of language and all of that sort of thing. Now, however, in the news, if we were to go by the news, the challenge at the moment seems to be that China and some ASEAN countries, some Southeast Asian countries are having great difficulties getting along. You mentioned Vietnam, and of course, Vietnam had its conflict with China, but now seems to be more of good neighbors, particularly on the economic front. But it's the Philippines that now everybody is looking at, and that's where I come from. If I might ask you, first of all, about the conflict in the Philippines and the South China Sea, because this would seem to be the elephant in the room in the relationship. There are 6 claimant countries, but really it's mainly with the Philippines that China has friction, great difficulty with. Why is that? In other words, and also should we be very concerned about where the situation is, because now we have daily altercations between Philippine vessels and Chinese vessels of different types. Whereas if you look at China and Vietnam, that have a similar kind of conflict over structures in the South China Sea, there isn't really much at all. So first of all, focus on the Philippines and China, and how do you read this particular conflict and the risks involved today? Right.
In the book, actually, I mentioned, like, I'm not going to talk about territorial disputes because this is a topic being covered by many other scholars, and I don't need to repeat them, right? But then again, I can offer my personal take in terms of why specifically right now there is this intensification of conflict between Philippines and China, and also how does it fit into the broad scheme of things,
Exactly.
And in comparison with Vietnam. So I think we look at, I think one of the ways to look at Philippine relation with China is through the lens of great power rivalry between China and the U.S. Right. So my take on the current intensification of conflict between Philippines and China is, on the one hand, is Beijing is testing the resolve of Washington in terms of how much commitment there is going to be for Philippines, supporting for the Philippines. And on the other hand, I think it's also on the Philippine side is testing Washington's resolve in terms of how much commitment the U.S. actually has for Philippines to support its ally. Because the Philippines is different from Thailand. Thailand does not have the treaty for mutual defense sort of obligation, but Philippines does. So I think for me, if I look at this sort of daily altercations, right? So for me, it is in fact is U.S. China is testing each other's resolve and its commitment for how to handle the tension in South China Sea. So and the Beijing's perspective, right? And then I think if you read the Chinese news, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs sort of read out, they usually mention two things when it gets to the Philippines. The first one is about is external powers interference, and that usually referring to the United States, right? The second point usually they emphasize in the Philippines is somehow there was some kind of agreement between Duterte and China.
The previous president of the Philippines.
And then they argue this time around that gentleman agreement was not abided by. But that, in some ways, for me, the difference between Philippines and Vietnam is that China felt many of disputes with Vietnam can be dealt with bilaterally, but in the Philippines case, it cannot. Right? In some ways, the U.S. is very prominently involved.
Now, do you think there's an end game, though, here? Because if you go to inside the Beltway in Washington,
yes,
you will hear people say that essentially what China wants is to depose the United States as the ultimate security guarantor in this region, and they want to create some kind of tribute system, Southeast Asia being sort of paying tribute essentially to Beijing. What do you see as the essential risk, or if there is an end game, an end goal, an objective here, besides what you just said?
Yeah, so personally, I don't think China has a particular, let's say, goal to put Southeast Asia within its sphere of influence. I don't think that is the necessary intention. But Beijing's intention in this particular case is, is try to prevent U.S. from accessing this region. And in particular in the Philippine case, and I think for me it is a test on the commitment part of the U.S. resolve. So that means the end game, right? I mean, I don't know. It can go all different kind of ways, right? Depending on how much, for example, U.S. is really genuinely willing to commit to defend the Philippines, and how much sort of resources the U.S. is willing to spend on the Philippines to militarily sort of empower the Philippines defense, right? So I don't know. But I think in the current altercation, for me, the way to read it is in some ways is the commitment and then the resolve issue regarding U.S. And I think U.S. is also testing China in terms of how much sort of China is committed really to use force in this particular case.
And I think this is an important issue, largely because with elections coming up in the United States, however the outcome, the level of commitment of Washington to the Philippines or the broader ASEAN is a valid question, right? Because you might get someone who is a very transactional U.S. president versus someone who is a little bit more, somewhat more methodical, but maybe actually harder on the Chinese side than the other guy, the former guy.
Right. But on the other hand, I think Philippines in some ways is very unique in Southeast Asia, in a sense that China probably think Philippines cannot be, let's say for example, like there are many countries in Southeast Asia, right? Some countries China think it can be potential, is winnable allies, you know, and the Philippines they think it's a lost game, right? Because Philippines traditionally is extremely pro-US, right? So in that sense, Beijing thinks it probably it's not worthwhile to spend too much capital in terms of trying to win the minds of Philippines because it doesn't really work. Right. So instead, it spend quite a lot of effort, you know, for example, to win the heart and mind of the Singaporeans, the Thais, and the Malaysians, and the Indonesians, right? So that, in fact, you can see the recent Pure survey, for example, right? It's actually quite surprising. You know, Singapore, more than 60% of Singaporeans have positive views of China. Thailand, also about 60%, which is very high. Think about it, you know. So that's why I think in the end, I think China is willing, because of the low cost involved in the Philippine case, in the sense that try to make something out of it, in a way, try to sort of, you know, I think Ian Chong from NUS, he used this sort of metaphor, right? Kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, right? And then in this particular case, Philippines is the chicken.
Ooh, I don't know if I like that.
Well, this is not my metaphor. It's Ian Chong. So you can. There's a paper he published on it. He used this particular metaphor.
I'm 17% Chinese, but I'm 75% Filipino. So keep that in mind. This actually brings me to my next question, which is, you know, ASEAN has always referred to this principle of centrality, that ASEAN is central to the economic network in this region, the strategic network. It's almost the balancing, the fulcrum for all the different power relationships in the region. But that would suggest what you're talking about, that China is almost like picking certain people to be good friends or picking on certain people, that China doesn't respect that, that principle of centrality, which is so dear to Southeast Asians in ASEAN. Would you agree with that?
I would say I agree to some extent. Yes, right. And in some ways, I think what you described in terms of, you know, picking on particular sort of, you know, countries such as the Philippines, in the sense that it is sort of, let's say, like try to at least sowing discord within ASEAN in terms of its unity and its relation between ASEAN countries, right? But on the other hand, I think when we get to ASEAN centrality, and then there are different ways to understand what is centrality actually means, right? So one thing, and then it can go the other way around. Essentially, I mean, you can actually argue ASEAN centrality has been quite good for China for the past decade or so, right? So that means when recent years, when the U.S. tried to push a new concept of Indo-Pacific, for example, and then you come out, you see that with all the languages of Indo-Pacific, right? There's no mention of ASEAN at all, right? There's no Asia even, right? So that means today, for example, in diplomatic languages from Beijing extremely emphasize on centrality of ASEAN, because they try to, because for Beijing that ASEAN centrality has worked very well for China. Because previously, you know, ASEAN +3 model has been essentially...
It was a China idea.
Exactly. And also, also its exclusion of the United States in its formula. Right. So then when the U.S. talk about Indo-Pacific, then China would not mention Indo-Pacific at all. So when Xi Jinping went to Thailand last year or the year before for the APEC meeting, for example, he did not, his speech, for example, did not mention Indo-Pacific at all. But in contrast, if you look at, DC or Japan, basically pretty much everything is Indo-Pacific these days.
Well, indeed, the Indo-Pacific construct has been sort of the new thing, right?
Exactly.
It's a new shiny thing inside the Beltway. And yes, so give equal time, the United States itself, by kind of promoting Indo-Pacific, which it kind of borrowed from Japan. Japan's definition is a bit different, but Japan and Australia to a lesser extent. But the United States itself is possibly stirring the pot when it comes to ASEAN centrality by
I think US
emphasizing
does not, exactly. US
it's
also
as much of a sinner in this area.
Right, and I think in the U.S. foreign policy, I mean, in Beltway, for example, these days in Washington, right? I think nobody think about ASEAN centrality, right? It's all about the Quad. It's about Indo-Pacific sort of
AUKUS,
exactly,
which
is in some ways is actual regional
right
actors, right, from Britain to Australia to New Zealand, rather than sort of talking to people in Jakarta versus Bangkok. Yeah.
You went to Laos and you were talking about the infrastructure development.
Right.
You clearly went to Vientiane, and was that your photograph of
That was
Vientiane?
my own picture, yes.
So oddly enough, just about 2 months ago, I went to Luang Prabang.
Oh, you did? Okay.
So you took the train.
I did.
I went to look at the tracks.
Okay.
And I find it very interesting because one of the things I was interested in was, this was a Belt and Road project, this high-speed rail from Kunming to Vientiane and stopping in Luang Prabang. And if you go to Luang Prabang today, which is off-season, the predominant most of the tourists today in Luang Prabang are mainland Chinese right now in off-season.
Okay.
Largely because the access is so easy now and the daily train. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia, because often the focus on Belt and Road analysis has been on Belt and Road in Africa generally, whereas actually Southeast Asia has been a kind of important platform for the Belt and Road. You mentioned the high-speed rail projects. Malaysia has some port projects that are involved. Indonesia actually has its already operational high-speed rail from Bandung to Jakarta. I'm wondering if you talk about, because the Belt and Road has been one of those issues, one of the signature foreign economic policy of China that's become very controversial. The U.S. and the West generally suspicious of it. How do Southeast Asians, how have countries in Southeast Asia receive the Belt and Road? I mean, the Philippines has been very skeptical.
Right. And in fact, I mean, nothing really happened in the Philippines. Many of the projects they promised in the end, I think, due to mutual reasons, right? I mean, in the end, didn't happen.
Right.
Yeah.
So, overall, how do you see the reception of the Belt and Road, and what has been the impact of Belt and Road in Southeast Asia on the broader image and effectiveness of the Belt and Road of BRI?
Right. So, first of all, I don't really have hard data on sort of region-wise, like public opinion data on the perceptions of Belt and Road Initiative, right? But I did. We run 2 rounds of survey in Thailand in terms of people's perceptions of sort of Chinese investment and also infrastructure, etc. So in general, I mean, in some ways, our data was confirmed by the Pew data. In some ways, Thai public perception of a PRC in some ways was quite positive on economic investment and infrastructure and etc. So I don't have data on Indonesia or in Laos, but I think from sort of secondary literature reading, right, the railway in Laos was also popular on the public level, right? It might not be financially feasible in the long term, for how much money it would be generate for Lao government, or whether it will be like debt trap, etc. But then for public perception of this railway, it has been overall positive. So same thing for the Indonesian one as well. In a way that media, for example, talk about generally the public in Java tend to perceive positively of the railway and its operation. But that doesn't mean those infrastructure projects will not have its negative consequences, right? So that means you have environmental problems, you have land issues, land rights disputes, etc. So those are things I think are sort of, in some ways, like natural outcomes in a way, yeah.
Indeed, I can report that when I went to check out the tracks
Right.
outside Luang Prabang, 2 years after they were constructed, almost pristine conditions.
Oh.
And also I feel that the population around, that's living around, were looking on it like, practically sacred ground almost.
So this is actually interesting. So in the Laos situation, right? When I took the train, as I talked to a few people as well, and then obviously it's not very scientific, but I think some other people who really study Laos and I can correspond. So first of all, there is obviously quite a lot of Chinese tourists going to Thailand to Laos with the railway. But in fact, I would say the biggest number of tourists making use of the railway in Laos is Thai. It's actually Thailand as neighboring populous country is actually quite a lot of tourists going to Thailand to Laos to make use of the railway.
Oh, interesting.
And then also what's interesting is that this railway has in some ways has significantly transformed the landscape, urban geography of Laos. And it also has implications for how local people understand about distance, about time, about space. Right, so many of those kind of things previously didn't exist, right? Particularly in terms of time, right? Because like modern people, we know there's 5 o'clock you have to go to, a meeting or something. But previously in Laos, everything runs relatively randomly or off schedule in a way, right? But nowadays the train comes very punctually at a particular moment of like 10 o'clock, and then you see the taxi drivers wait outside at the train station to take passengers. And they know because there's only 6 trains a day for long distance trains, so they have to be punctual. Otherwise, they'll miss the passengers. To take them because the railway station was very far from Luang Prabang's city center. It's like half an hour or so. Yeah.
Now, I'll get to the audience for your questions, so be ready. And I'm just going to ask one more question, but when you ask a question, please introduce yourself and your affiliation. My last question before we go to the audience, Japan.
Yes.
Because talking about infrastructure in the region in Southeast Asia, actually Japan is still the biggest investor for the most part in infrastructure. And of course, Japan has tried to distinguish itself from China's efforts and the BRI by emphasizing quality, with the implication being that what China is doing is not quite quality. I'm wondering whether, how you see Japan's role evolving in this intimate relations that you've described, multifaceted relations between China and Southeast Asia.
Yeah. So Japan's role, so in some way, Japanese products, I would say, overall of better quality, right? But they're also more expensive. So in a sense, when it get to Thailand, to Southeast Asian government, when they try to have a bit of different projects, and usually, honestly, the real contender usually are Japan versus China, right? For many railway projects, etc., and ports as well. So in Thailand's case, for example, Thai government very deliberately played one against the other in their bidding process, to get the price down and also try to get a much better deal for the loans, right? So in the end, I think for Thailand, Japan won the line from Bangkok to Chiang Mai, and China won the other line, from Bangkok to Nong Khai. But in the end, the line to Chiang Mai is not going to happen because Japan finally realized that this is not financially feasible, so Japan stopped it, right? So I would say the Japan's role, as I said, Japan has been a long partner for many countries in Southeast Asia for basic infrastructure and also high-end stuff, right? So in the current situation, Japan is, I would say, the main competitor for China for delivering of quality products, right? So the question is whether you can afford it. It's expensive. So I think for countries such as like poorer countries, and I think probably would be difficult, right? But then again, I would say if you say we think about like if Singapore is going to build the line connecting KL with Singapore, I think they probably wouldn't go for Japan model.
Yes, well,
Because
that's
they
an
can afford
interesting question. All right, I saw this gentleman here first, and if you could please wait for the microphone and introduce yourself and your affiliation, please. Thank you. Yes, however you wish.
All right. With respect, let me
Just speak into the microphone.
Yeah. My name is Lind, one of the ASHK Global Fellows. Just arrived 2 days ago. Thank you for your insight. And I want to ask about the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative. It's took now over 10 years.
Right.
Why so slow in implementations?
Right.
That's the first question. But we have they planned the upside-down Y-shaped China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, starting from Quimet to Rayleigh. Now it's railway is finished. Rayleigh to Mandalay, the middle part of Myanmar, is to go to Chao Pyu to get access to the Indian Oceans, to avoid the Malacca dilemma, which is controlled by the U.S. And they want to come down from Mandalay to Yangon, like the upside-down Y. But these areas have conflict, right? And also, like we have a west to east from Myanmar.
The question, please.
Okay, so that's pipelines. We have a problem because China is so worried about it. And there's also rising the China sentiment in Myanmar due to fuel and backed by the Myanmar military government. That's why Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi went to Myanmar. And there's also, he mentioned at the Lanchan Mekong meeting recently in Thailand, he worried about the third point, the third rules is about foreign powers in Myanmar. Stuff like that. What does he mean? What is he worried about? Is there like a new Cold War between the U.S. versus the Russia and China in Myanmar? So I want to know about your
so
offering.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, right, on paper has been in place for, at least since Suu Kyi was in office, 2015 onwards. But in reality, I would say the feasibility is quite low, right? This is obviously because of the fact that Myanmar's domestic politics is not stable, right? Myanmar is very fragmented, and particularly the railway. If you look at on paper, sure, from Rayleigh down to Mandalay through, etc., is doable. But then again, if you ever actually been to Mandalay and to Lashio, the road is very bad condition. Even the regular, like road is not even highway. It's like dirt road, very bumpy, and particularly the ones from Lashio upwards to Mujie, that's even not passable when it gets to rainy season. It's going to be so muddy. All the trucks will be stuck in the mud. So that means lots of things look good on paper, but then in reality, they will be very difficult to be delivered, right? So I think in Myanmar's case, in its sort of political fragmentation and the chaos right now, right? I mean, fighting, in Lashio region, northern Shan. So I think those kind of projects of railway or other things, I think they are definitely like shelved, for the long distant future, right? Now, in terms of what China wants from Myanmar, I think China wants a lot of things from Myanmar. And I think, I don't think China has interest in taking over Myanmar, but it does see great potential in Myanmar, right? It sees Myanmar has lots of resources. Myanmar is easy accessible to the Bay of Bengal and many other things. But it also worry about Myanmar as the soft underbelly for China's border region, right? So that's why, even before the current episode, before when KIA was fighting around 2013, 12, etc., they worried about U.S. sort of have access via KIA, Kachin Independence Army for China. So right now, I think what Wang Yi was referring to, probably because the U.S. State Department met with NUG in Vietnam, right? They had a meeting. 16 online, yeah. So I think now the Burma lobby probably is one of the most powerful in Washington, right? Of all the Southeast Asian countries, Myanmar actually has a quite prominent place within congressional politics in Washington. So that means there is genuine interest, I would say, in the U.S. as well as other Western countries in Myanmar to be democratic, so basically to support a democratic government in Myanmar. So I think that is genuine and long-term kind of interest in the U.S. So then China tend to view things on the ground via the lens of great power politics, right? And then, so that's basically, I would say, people do caution again. I actually wrote about it in some ways. It should not be that way, right? If either Washington or Beijing view Myanmar via the lens of great power politics, in the end, the outcome for Myanmar is going to be bad, right? So the better option is to not be the point in the middle of great power politics, right? So I think, and I think NUG understand that. So that's why NUG early this year, right, issued its 10-point position on China policy, right? And I think it's very deliberate, where they try to sort of have a non-pro-Western, pro-US kind of policy. And I think that is after very careful calculation. Yeah.
Please, I see the lady there with the glasses. Sorry, and then we'll go to someone at the back there. The other lady with the glasses up top. Yeah, I'll try to get it to everybody. But so if maybe we collect those two questions. So please introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Thank you. I look forward to reading the book.
Student.
I spoke to you about a PhD program. Yes, I'm at City University at the moment. I'm Kira Morris, PhD student there. My question is about the distinction between state and non-state Chinese actors and their influence in Southeast Asia.
Right.
So it's in a couple of parts. Firstly, what are these non-state actors? You mentioned private companies, but are there civil society actors at play as well? And how do you distinguish between state and non-state actors? Given what we know about the Chinese party state, how do you also account for any state influence on non-state actors? That would be great to hear. Thank you.
Okay. Now,
let me collect because just for the sake of time, and the lady there, and then the gentleman ahead of you, in front of you. Yeah, so please.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Jenny Burke. I'm the Consul General of Ireland to Hong Kong. And first of all, let me say thank you very much, Professor Han, for a very interesting presentation. And the chat is fascinating as well. So my question is really, I think, about diaspora. So obviously, Ireland, we have a huge diaspora, and that relationship between power and influence is related to that for us. So whereas we might not be seen as a particularly powerful country, we talk about soft power a lot, we wield quite significant influence comparatively internationally because of our influence, that a lot of it is to do with diaspora. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about if and how Chinese historical and contemporary diaspora plays a part in influence in Southeast Asia.
And then can you just pass it to the gentleman in front of you, and then we'll have you answer these three questions.
Okay. Hello, sir. I'm your student in HKU in the coming semester. I'm just come back from Cornell, Vietnam capital, last week. I agree with you that the China's influence in Southeast Asia is keep rising. However, I also think that it's important to keep Southeast Asia as a neutral place politically, as you have heard the bamboo diplomats of Vietnam, and I think it's also in favor of the Chinese interest to do that. And remember the historical meeting between the President presidency and the Chinese President Ma Ying-jeou in 2015 was held in Singapore, and the other historical meeting between President Trump and North Korea leader Kim Jong-un is held in Vietnam. So, Professor, my question is, in terms of the interest of China, do you think that Southeast Asia should continue to be a buffer zone, a neutral political zone between the U.S. and China? Thank you.
Great.
Okay, so I will answer the question in order.
Right.
So first about non-state actors and their relation with the state, and I think you're right. In some situations, it's difficult to separate the state and its proxy, right? And also in many instances, the relationship between the state and these non-state actors, the influence relations is also complex. So what does that mean is that in some instances, for example, it is state deliberately making use of those non-state actors to advance its own interest. On the other hand, there are lots of non-state actors to take advantage of the state, to camouflage as state, and in some ways advance its interest. Right. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, one of the sort of related with the diaspora question as well. Like many of those, like say, diaspora leader, right? Usually they claim they have connections with Beijing in something, so that they can have a legitimacy and then authority in terms of delivering particular projects locally. So which means in this kind of case, it's non-state actors actually latch onto the state to provide legitimacy for themselves. So that's, I would say I agree with you, empirically in some instances it's difficult to separate them. But then there are also many other ones. For example, one chapter of the book talked about illicit economy. So we're referring to, in some ways, it's gangsters from China right now are running huge operations in Southeast Asia, right? So these are the these are the people who are on China's wanted list, right? So for example, there was one guy called Shi Zhijiang, right? He was the chairman for New New World projects, and he was wanted by Beijing. You know, he was captured in Bangkok, and then Beijing want him to be extradited to China. And he's right now fighting for extradition because he claimed he has a Cambodian passport, right? So things like that. There are actually lots of these kind of actors. They are actually against state. There are lots of criminal networks operating out from Southeast Asia. They are from China. So what I'm saying is, in reality, when you look at those actors, we're talking about millions and millions of people, you know. So some definitely has a connection with the state of some kind. Some try to run away from the state. Right?
Just a quick interjection that this is true actually in outside of Southeast Asia and even places like Canada and the United States. These are issues, right?
Right.
This kind of operation.
Right. I mean, you know, like what's his name? Miles Kwok, you know. He was like anti-CCP figure, but now he's in jail. So the question about diaspora, I was actually in Dublin in August, and there was a emigration museum, right? So that, I think Ireland really play sort of this sort of history of immigration. There's a Dublin portal, right, connecting Dublin with New York. So in China's case as well, and I think particularly for southern provinces of Guangdong and Fujian, many places also have similar museums about immigration, right, in terms of the places as the origin of the hometown of those diaspora, like they call it Chaoxiang, which essentially means the place where the overseas Chinese originally from. Now, but then again, today, when we think about PRC's foreign policy, right, and then one big component of PRC foreign policy is United Front for its diaspora, right? So if you look at United Front department, one big component of its work is overseas Chinese affairs, right? So that means the state is actively involved in trying to unite or lobby or co-opt variety of diaspora actors in Southeast Asia for its own purposes, either to advance its economic interest or to lobby local governments on its behalf, or to promote its agenda locally, right? So recently, there was a case in Singapore. A person of Hong Kong origin, of a Singaporean citizen, was categorized by Singapore government as a foreign agent working for PRC. So it's things like that, in a way, that get in the news, because then that means Beijing is deliberately utilizing its diaspora to lobby, to work on its behalf, right? To smooth the wheel and then build up relations with local politicians, etc. And I always say in this particular case, these networks, right? They are long-lasting, and then they are everywhere. Right, and then so this is in some ways what I mentioned early on about intimate China's relation with Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is the place where majority of overseas Chinese diaspora live. Right, it's in Southeast Asia. So they also have different political relations locally. Some countries, for example, are more hostile to the presence of overseas Chinese. Some countries are much less so. So today, for example, we think about Thailand, right? Pretty much all Thai politicians have some kind of Chinese connection, right? And in fact, these days, Thai politicians tend to proactively emphasize that Chinese connection, right? So this in some ways indicate that this is in some ways very similar to Ireland's case, right? Despite this political sort of a component, right? It is one advantage of China in Southeast Asia. But on the other hand, this is also a huge disadvantage for China. Why that is the case? Because, so this is actually a kind of an interesting anecdote somebody conveyed to me. So the story was that that person, right, did some research in Pakistan. So Pakistanis tend to have very positive view of China, right? But if you ask ordinary Pakistanis, have you ever met a Chinese person? They said no. But that is different from Southeast Asia, because almost everybody in Southeast Asia understands implicitly what a Chinese person should be, right? So there are lots of stereotypes has been deeply embedded culturally for local communities for the past century or so. So that in some ways is a baggage or liability for China in terms of people's views of China often are filtered through long-term interactions with the diaspora within Southeast Asia, either positively or negatively. So that's why when China relations with Indonesia or Malaysia, in some instances, for example, will be embroidered with the historical treatment of overseas Chinese in those countries, and then that will become a diplomatic sort of potential sort of problem.
We should probably, this is the third question about buffer zone.
Buffer zone. I actually think that we should give Southeast Asian countries more agency in terms of what they want for themselves, rather than looking at the perspective of China or the US. And I think Southeast Asia countries, they are not small players. And this is something I try to talk to my students, essentially. Many countries in Southeast Asia are big countries. Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world in terms of population. Philippines, more than 100 million population. Vietnam, also 100 million. These are large countries, right? So there are tremendous amount of agency in those countries in terms of what they want for the best of themselves. And I think we should respect that, right? So rather than sort of treat Southeast Asia as a playground for others. Yeah.
Okay, I'll collect another three if I can manage it. So Professor Ying, and then the lady here in front, Professor Ying Chan.
Hi, Ying Chen from University of Hong Kong. Your point on agency is very well taken. And globally, ASEAN still is underrepresented, underheard on the global stage. So I want to ask about the state of the media, news media, local and especially local media, and how does it account for this lack or absence of a voice in the global stage? What's the problem? And among the countries you look at, Singapore has a voice, right? But how about all the others, and Indonesia?
For the sake of proximity, there's a lady here, I think. Yes, and then the lady here. So just proximity of the microphone, we'll ask you.
Hello.
Yes, if you can introduce yourself and your affiliation, please.
Kanika Rakra, I'm from India. I'm also an AGI fellow for 2024.
Right.
I actually wanted to pick on something that you mentioned in the discussion earlier, where you were talking about Philippines as a point of contention between the US and China. And I was wondering, this is more a comment, so just maybe your thoughts on this. As US is a waning power, China is a rising power, so there's always going to be a sort of change in hegemonic understanding between the US and China as well. US is trying a little harder in Southeast Asia to establish its old connections. China is growing, so it's going to automatically have, as you mentioned in your slides as well, more economic clout, more security considerations as well. Between these two, how does agency for an actor like Philippines then come in the play? Because, okay, I'll stop here.
No, great. Thanks
Okay.
very much. Appreciate it. And then this lady here.
Thank you. I'm Agita. I am part of Asia Global Fellow, and I happen to be from Indonesia. So my questions is obviously in terms of Indonesia and China relations. Since we have a new elected president, Prabowo has recently met Xi Jinping in Beijing. We know that I completely agree that you mentioned that Indonesia is a flawed democracy because it feels that we are titling towards the dynasty, having Jokowi's son as an elected vice president. But having the Prabowo perspective and coming from military background, what is your perspective balancing the act? Do you think that Indonesia is going to have the policy shift in terms of balancing our economy in between Indonesia and China trade, compare with the current situations and never ending with South China Sea and Natuna Island that we have?
Right.
How do you see that? Thank you.
Now, Enze, I regret that we're running out of time,
Okay.
so your answers to all of those,
Be short.
as brief as you
Okay.
can, but you're going to answer them very
All right.
comprehensively,
Okay.
I'm sure.
First question about media. So I think there is, you're right, in a way that there is a lack of voices come from Southeast Asia. And I think that is in some way because of the lack of English media, right? And I think Singapore is the anglicized state in the region. That's why you have much more Singaporean sort of voices, perhaps, But on the other hand, we think about like media influence in the region. What aspect people have, I looked into it, people actually studied it in a way, is the Chinese media. Chinese language media in Southeast Asia. So this is in some ways, I would say, what China's influence in the past decade has increased, is that Beijing has acquired, they bought off lots of locally based, Southeast Asia based Chinese language newspapers, etc. that previously had been in circulation in Thailand or in Malaysia, in Indonesia, but then nowadays have been bought off by mainland capital. So that means that the agenda, right, for the Beijing's propaganda purposes is going to filter through locally based Chinese language media. So I think this is one area, I think, that people talk about diaspora influence, etc. And I think that exactly is where Beijing's influence will be.
Just quick interjection. Of course, Lian He Zhaobao in Singapore has been
Right.
accused by.
No, so that's, I would say,
that's one of the
is
issues.
exactly the point. Because, I already mentioned Pew Survey, right, talked about Singaporeans have positive view of China. 2 years ago, right, same Pew Survey, they did another survey of 20 countries in the world, and Singapore stand out again, was the one that has a very positive view of the PRC. So Singapore government at that time was puzzled, like why? Because Singapore elites tend to be anglicized, right? But then you have the mass, people at hawker centers, etc. They speak Chinese, they read Chinese newspapers, and then you read 联合早报. 早报 has very different views of China, right? So people who read 联合早报, your image of China is different from what you read from CNN, right? And that's essentially what it is, because people's views of PRC is much more complex than what you get from English media.
Then the Philippines.
Now, the Philippine case, and I think you're right in a way that the agency of the Philippines, right? And I think the agency of the Philippines, in some sense, has to do with the president at office, And I think we do see a lot more Philippines agencies when Duterte was in office, right? And then we see the Philippines in some ways, they actually, I would say, during the past decades or so, the Filipino presidency tend to swing back and forth between pro-PRC voices, you know. So Arroyo was much more pro-PRC a little bit, and then Aquino come back. And then Duterte went the other way around, and then now back to Marcos. So I think there is this kind of swing back and forth. So that is the agency, I would say. The Filipino domestic politics, that is the agency. So finally, for the question for Indonesia and Prabowo, yeah. So I think Indonesia, as I said, is a big country. So Indonesia historically also has a very distinct identity for its foreign policy, right? It's for non-alignment, and it's for its distinct kind of connection with the Muslim world, and then etc. Right? So I think this is an aspect. I think Indonesia is going to stay out from this sort of U.S.-China competition thing. I think Indonesia has enough capacity and then people and resources to have its own independent sort of foreign policy for itself. Right. And then on the other hand, I think the other way, as the sort of relate to what earlier people talk about great power politics, what do we mean by Southeast Asia relations with China, etc. In many other situations, in many instances actually, relations is not binary. It's not either China or the US. In reality, it's much more complicated than that, right? So, for example, in the recent State of Southeast Asia survey in Singapore, right, the result was that Malaysia and Indonesia become extremely pro-China for the recent publication, right? Why? It's not because they like China. It's because they don't like US. Because the Gaza situation, you know. So, like, if you were in Malaysia, since last year, in Indonesia, protest and a boycott of McDonald's, KFC, Starbucks. Basically, there's a very strong anti-American sentiment because of the Israel situation, rather than because they like China, right? So that means essentially is that for countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, right, this being Muslim kind of connect to identity, right, tied it to some of those elements that sort of has some commonality with China's emphasis on global South, perhaps, and I think this basically create some kind of commonality in their views of the West, perhaps, right? But doesn't really mean they like China. So I think that is very important distinction to be made on those kind of things.
Thank you very much. So in closing, I'm going to call on my, what percentage? I guess it's 10% European. I'm 8% Spanish and 2%, believe it or not, Norwegian. I'm going to call on that part of myself to stress what Europeans like to talk about, the strategic autonomy, right? And the ability of countries of Europe to articulate a foreign policy that is somewhat different from the United States. Is that possible? I think here in Southeast Asia, when we're talking about Southeast Asia, we have the same kind of challenge, right? And it's fantastic that people have brought up the word agency, because I think that's probably going forward. What is the quality? How do countries in the region exercise that agency? And I think about the U.S. and China as kind of on either side of a spectrum, and all the countries in the world in the middle, and their hingeability from one side to the other kind of varies. So Canada, where I'm sort of from, Canada has difficulty hinging because it geographically has to hinge really more to the U.S. A country like Myanmar is much more hinging towards China. And maybe it's in India that's almost, being very artful and hinging between the two rather artfully, right? And how countries hinge between the U.S. and China is going to be very important. You can whinge about it. You can complain that please, why are we forced to make choices? You can binge, and you can go all the way one side to the U.S. or all the way one side to China, or you can hinge, and you can figure out how to hinge between the two in a kind of artful, strategic way that articulates your agency, right? Expresses your own interests in the world. And that's kind of the biggest challenge I think that countries in the world now have to do. I'm over time, which I always do in my classes. Hard to keep students here, but thank you for all staying. And thank you very much, Enze, for your very enlightening talk and also the discussion. So please, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So thank you. And as Holly had as Alison mentioned, book copies of the book Ripple Effect are at the back. And Enze, you'll be happy to take more questions or to sign books.
I can take questions if you have.
Yeah.
I hope to get, if you have any other questions, I will be happy to answer them. If you want me to sign a book, I'll be happy to do that as well.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.